Wychford-on-Avon was the kind of English market town that had been maintaining its appearance of complete ordinariness for so long that the maintenance had become genuine. The high street presented its brick fronts to the October morning with the composure of a thing that has nothing to hide, because it has been hiding it successfully for 3 generations. The draper's window showed a careful arrangement of autumn fabrics. The bakery produced, at 6 o'clock each morning, a smell of bread that the whole street benefited from. The solicitor's office, Cavendish & Sons, established 1887, the brass plate polished to a condition that suggested either great civic pride or considerable anxiety, occupied its corner premises with the settled authority of something that expects to be there indefinitely. The church bells had rung at 8. The market square had conducted its Tuesday business and was now in the process of disbanding with the particular English efficiency of an activity that has been performed on the same site for several centuries and requires no instruction. A woman in a good grey coat was walking her dog along the far pavement with the upright purposefulness of a woman who walks for reasons she does not find it necessary to explain to anyone. Hercule Poirot observed all of this from the sitting-room window of Dr. James Sheppard's house on Elm Row, where he had been a guest for 4 days and had found the experience entirely satisfactory. Dr. Sheppard was an old acquaintance. They had encountered each other during a matter in Sunningdale 12 years previous and had maintained, in the intervening years, the kind of friendship that consists primarily of occasional correspondence and the genuine pleasure of the other person's company when occasion brought it about. He was a bachelor Sheppard with a practice of 20 years in Wychford, a housekeeper of the reliable sort, and the quality of intelligence that Poirot had always found most comfortable in company. The kind that does not need to demonstrate itself constantly but is simply present, reliably, when required. "Tell me about Avonmere House," Poirot said. Sheppard looked up from his newspaper. He had been reading the cricket scores with the patient attention of a man for whom October cricket scores are primarily a form of companionable silence. "Renwick's place," he said. "You've noticed it." "I have walked past it twice." "It is the kind of house that invites attention while appearing to discourage it. A very particular combination." "3 generations of Renwicks," Sheppard said, setting his paper down with the resignation of a man who has learned that when Poirot asks about something, it is because the grey cells have already identified it as significant. "Gerald Renwick, retired judge. Queen's Bench, 20 years. Retired in 1930, which was rather earlier than anyone expected, though no one quite liked to ask why." He paused. "He's been away most of this year. Switzerland. His heart, officially. Something else, one suspected, though he's never been the kind of man who illuminates his own interior landscape. He has returned. 2 weeks ago, I saw him on the high street on Wednesday. He looked different, not merely thinner, which he is." Was something had resolved in him, the expression of a man who has made up his mind about something after a long period of not having done so. Sheppard looked at Poirot. "Why are you asking?" "I am asking," Poirot said, "because the same expression you are describing I also observed on Wednesday when I passed him on the road below the house. He was walking slowly and looking at the town with the specific attention of someone returning to a place they have complicated feelings about and have decided to resolve those feelings in a particular way. He looked out at the street. And I am asking because this morning, quite early, I observed from this window a motor car arriving at Avonmere House and a man emerging from it whom I recognized as Leonard Ashe, a solicitor with offices in Leamington Spa, whose name I know because he was, some years ago, mentioned in connection with a case of mine in an entirely peripheral capacity. He is not from Wychford. He was expected. Someone opened the door before he knocked." Sheppard looked at him for a moment. "And from this you conclude?" "I conclude nothing yet, I observe. I note that a man returns from 6 months in Switzerland with the expression of someone who has decided to correct something. I note that he invites to his house a person who has a specific prior connection to his professional life and who has not visited, to your knowledge, in how long?" "Years," Sheppard said slowly. "Ashe worked for Gerald as a clerk. when Gerald was still in chambers. Before he retired, there was some kind of falling out. I never knew the details. He hasn't been to Avonmere in at least 10 years. More, 11, Poirot said. He turned from the window. I believe Mr. Gerald Renwick is in the process of addressing something that occurred 11 years ago. Whether this process will go smoothly or whether it will encounter the particular kind of resistance that such processes encounter when the people required to participate in them have spent 11 years arranging their lives around the assumption that the process would never occur. This I cannot yet say. He said this on Tuesday morning. By Thursday evening, Gerald Renwick was dead. The call came to Sheppard's house at 9:30. It was Sheppard who was called as Gerald's physician, and Poirot who was present when the call arrived, and who accompanied Sheppard to Avonmere House with the quiet determination of a man for whom the phrase, "I'm afraid you'd better come, doctor," has always been, as simultaneously an invitation and a problem. The October night was cold and very still, the elms along the road holding their remaining leaves with diminishing conviction, the town dark and silent in the way of English market towns after 9 o'clock, which is a silence that suggests everything respectable has gone to bed and left the rest of the night to sort itself out. Inspector Barker of the Wychford Constabulary was already at Avonmere House when they arrived. A solid, competent man whose expression indicated that he was dealing with something that exceeded his confidence in his own resources and was managing this through the application of systematic procedure. He received Poirot with the expression of a man who has heard of this person and is not entirely certain whether the hearing represents an advantage or a complication. The study was at the back of the house, overlooking the garden. Gerald Renwick was in his chair. His pen was in his hand. On the writing paper before him were 9 words in his controlled, judicial hand, and the 9 words ended mid-sentence. And the sentence that had not yet been completed was the sentence that someone in this house had been prepared to commit a very serious crime to prevent. Poirot stood in the doorway of the study and read the 9 words and was quiet for a moment with the weight of what they represented. A man who had come home to speak and had been silenced before the first sentence was finished. "I will need," he said to Inspector Barker, with the quiet authority of a man who has done this many times, "to speak with each member of the household tomorrow morning. Separately, and without interruption." He looked at the 9 words once more. Mr. Renwick had a great deal left to say. It is now the work of the little grey cells to say it for him. The household of Avonmere assembled for Poirot in the drawing room at 9 o'clock on the Friday morning, in the particular arrangement that grief and shock and concealment produce when all 3 are present in the same group of people and none of them can be cleanly separated from the others. The drawing room was a room of settled, genuine comfort, not the performed comfort of a house that is always expecting guests, but the authentic comfort of a room that has been lived in by the same family for 50 years and has absorbed their specific preferences, their tolerances and their intolerances, in the way that rooms do when they are inhabited rather than merely occupied. The curtains were good dark blue wool. The pictures were family paintings of the kind that nobody outside the family would particularly covet, but that the family would never part with. The fire had been lit early and was doing its work seriously. Outside the tall windows, the October garden was brown and gold and perfectly still. Mrs. Dorothea Renwick sat in the chair that was unmistakably hers, the high-backed one near the fire, slightly separate from the others, the chair of the person around whose preferences the room had been arranged. She was 62, and she had the quality of a woman who had spent 40 years as the practical intelligence of a household managed by a man whose intelligence was of a different, less domestic kind. She was not performing grief. She was not performing anything. She looked at Poirot with the direct assessing regard of a woman who has spent her life evaluating situations accurately and is doing so now with the same thoroughness she would bring to any other situation, regardless of its personal cost. "You will tell us what you need from us," she said. "We will give it." Philip Renwick sat on the sofa beside his wife, which was physically the correct position and emotionally the most complicated one in the room. He was 38, with the surface presentation of a man who has spent his professional life in a solicitor's practice. Measured, correct, reliable, the sort of man who inspires confidence in clients because he gives the consistent impression of knowing what he is doing. Behind this presentation this morning, something was working very hard. It was working so hard that the effort of containing it was visible in the specific set of his shoulders, the way his hands rested in his lap, with a stillness that was not natural relaxation, but concentrated will. Nora Renwick, his wife, sat beside him with the composed watchfulness that Poirot had observed on his arrival the previous evening. She was 35, dark-haired, with the particular quality of attention that some people develop when they have spent years in proximity to a situation they understand more completely than the people around them. She looked at Poirot and then at her husband, in a sequence that was brief enough to appear casual and that Poirot had no difficulty reading. Miss Clara Renwick sat in the small armchair near the window, at a slight remove from the others.
She was 34 and had the quality of a person who has been in the same place long enough that their presence is taken for granted, which is different from being unimportant and is sometimes confused with it. She was the one who had stayed, who had not married and had not moved to a city and had not built a life structured around departure, but had remained at Avonmere, occupying the role of the daughter who manages the practical life of the parents with the competence of someone who did not choose the role but has grown into it with genuine capability. She looked this morning frightened in a very specific way. The frightened look of someone who has a piece of information and does not know what it means and is afraid of what it might mean. Dr. Owen Marsh arrived at 9:15, slightly late.
With the unruffled manner of a country physician who has been managing crises for 25 years and has learned that unhurried competence is more useful than prompt anxiety. He had the look of a man who had slept badly, not from grief, but from the activity of a conscience conducting its own inquiry in the small hours. He greeted the family with the warmth of 20 years of house calls and accepted the chair beside the fire that Mrs. Renwick indicated with the ease of someone who has sat in that chair many times before. Leonard Ashe sat apart near the door, in the position of someone who is present because they were here when the event occurred, and not because this house is their territory. He was 50, lean, with the compressed quality of a man who has spent a long time managing limited resources with maximum efficiency. Not mean, but careful. The carefulness of someone for whom carelessness has historically been expensive. He looked at nothing in particular and at everything simultaneously, which Poirot recognized as the professional attention of a man whose own career had been formed in the law. Mrs. Hilda Potts did not sit. She stood near the door, not the door Ashe was beside, but the servants' door at the room's far end, with her hands folded before her in the attitude of a woman who has been standing in the appropriate position in this room for 22 years and who, on this particular morning, was also standing in a very different sense. Standing on something she knew and not yet knowing whether to step off it or remain. Poirot looked at each of them in the brief, complete way that served him as an introduction to any group he was about to work with. And then he said pleasantly, with the formality appropriate to the occasion, "I am grateful to you all for your presence this morning. I know it is not easy. I will be as direct with you as the situation permits, and I ask the same in return." He paused. Mr. Renwick had something he intended to say last evening, before he retired to his study. He had been preparing to say it since he returned from Switzerland. Someone in this house knew what he intended to say and was prepared to prevent it by any means necessary. He looked around the room. "I'm going to find out who that person is. In my experience, the most efficient way to do this is honesty from everyone in the room. The truth has a way of cooperating with Monsieur Poirot when the alternative is demonstrated to be worse." He let this settle. He watched each face process it.
The drawing room fire crackled.
Outside, a single leaf detached from the nearest elm and fell through the still October air with the leisurely precision of a thing that has decided its time has come. "I will speak with each of you individually," Poirot said. "I will begin with Mrs. Potts." He saw, across the room, Philip Renwick's hands tighten fractionally in his lap. He noted it and moved on. Mrs. Hilda Potts had worked at Avonmere House since she was 23 years old, which meant she had been there longer than Philip Renwick's marriage, longer than Clara's adult life, longer than anyone except Mrs. Renwick herself had been part of the household's daily fabric. 22 years was long enough to know a house the way one knows a language. Not merely its vocabulary, but its grammar, the rules beneath the rules. It is the way it sounds when everything is normal and the different sound it makes when something is not. She sat across from Poirot in the small morning room to which he had retired for his interviews, a room of modest comfort, looking onto the kitchen garden, chosen because it was the room in which none of the family held particular authority and in which a housekeeper might feel fractionally less disadvantaged by the geography of the conversation. She was 45, solid, with the composed face of someone who has managed the emotional range of a full family for 2 decades and has developed the specific capability of containment that this management requires. But there was something behind the containment this morning that was not its normal, settled quality. It was the containment of someone actively holding something rather than naturally resting. "You have worked here for 22 years, Poirot said. "Since the spring of 1914, she said. "Before the war. Miss Clara was 12 years old. Master Philip was 16. You know this house and this family with the thoroughness that only long service provides." "I know them," she said, with the precise understatement of someone who has seen a great deal and has been professional about all of it. "Last evening," Poirot said, with the gentle, unhurried quality he brought to conversations that required something difficult to be said, "you were in the kitchen at 8:50 in the evening." She was still. "The kitchen is at the rear of the house, connected to the study corridor by the serving passage." "It is a long passage. I walked it this morning. But the acoustics of a stone-floored passage carry sound in the way that such passages have always done. A voice in the corridor outside the study would be audible, if muffled, to someone in the kitchen. A pause, a long one. The kitchen garden outside the window was very still. "Yes," she said. "You heard a voice." I heard a voice in the corridor, speaking." She stopped. "Speaking quietly, not in conversation." There was no reply. "Speaking to," I thought, "to himself, or..." She stopped again. "Or to someone who was not answering," Poirot said. "Someone who was already past answering." The quality of her stillness changed. It was the stillness of someone who has been carrying a weight alone and has just been offered help with it, and is discovering that the offer brings its own complexity, the relief and the terror arriving simultaneously. "I didn't know," she said. "When I heard it, I didn't know what it meant. I heard his voice, Mr. Philip's voice, in the corridor, and I thought he'd gone to speak to his father, and I thought nothing of it, because why would I? He had every right to speak to his father." She looked at the window. "And then at 9:15, Miss Clara came down to the kitchen saying she'd knocked on the study door and received no answer, and something in her face made me go up with her, and we found him." She stopped. "And I thought perhaps I'd been wrong about whose voice it was. I told myself I might have been wrong. The passage is long, the acoustics." "You were not wrong," Poirot said very gently. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, the containment was still present, but the thing behind it had changed its character. It was no longer held in the way of something being concealed, but held in the way of something waiting to be put down. "I've been with this family for 22 years, she said. "Mr. Philip grew up in this house. His mother, Mrs. Renwick. She's been nothing but..." She stopped. I told myself it wasn't conclusive. A voice in a corridor. It wasn't conclusive. "No," Poirot agreed. On its own, it was not conclusive, but evidence is not required to be conclusive on its own. It is required to be truthful. The truthful things assembled together become conclusive. You have been carrying a truthful thing. It has been heavy." She looked at him with the expression of someone who has been given a more precise description of their experience than they expected from a source they would not have expected it from. "Yes," she said quietly. "It has been very heavy. I need you to tell me exactly what you heard. The time, the quality of the voice, the words if there were any, and I need you to tell it with the completeness that you have been unable to give to the rest of the household." He paused. "You are not responsible for what was done before you spoke, but your silence now, if maintained, would be a different kind of responsibility. I think you understand this." "I've understood it since 9:15 last night," she said. "I simply needed someone to tell me that understanding it was sufficient reason to speak." She told him everything. The time, 8:50, confirmed by the kitchen clock she had glanced at when she heard the voice. The quality, Philip's voice, she was certain, a voice she had known for 38 years. A single brief exchange of words, muffled by the passage but distinguishable. "Don't," she had heard, she thought. And then, "This is the only way." And then, nothing. And then, from the study, the sound of a decanter being set down on a wooden surface. A sound she recognized because she set it down herself every evening when she prepared Mr. Renwick's study for his nightly hour of correspondence. The decanter of brandy, the glass beside it, the nightly ritual of the house, as reliable as the church bells, as predictable as the morning's bread. Poirot thanked her. He said before she left, the thing he had included in the summary he had been composing in his own mind since his arrival at Avonmere. "You are not responsible for what was done with what you did not say, but you are responsible now for what you do say. And the difference between those two responsibilities is the whole distance between the past and what comes next." She stood at the door for a moment with this. Then she said, "Will Mrs. Renwick?" "Mrs. Renwick will know in time everything that is true. I cannot protect her from truth, and I would not if I could. What I can do is ensure that the truth is complete, that she knows not only what was done, but what her husband came home to accomplish and why, and that his last act was not weakness but its opposite." He paused. He came home to speak. He spoke 9 words before someone silenced him. "It will be the work of this inquiry to finish his sentence." She left. Poirot sat for a moment in the morning room with the kitchen garden outside and the autumn stillness of it, and thought about a voice in a corridor and the specific weight of 22 years of loyalty, meeting the specific impossibility of what that loyalty was being asked to absorb. The grey cells were working. They would continue to work through the morning, through 4 more conversations, through the careful assembly of a picture that was becoming piece by piece complete. Leonard Ashe had the quality of a man who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen for 11 years and has spent those 11 years in the simultaneous states of hoping it would not happen and knowing it must. He sat across from Poirot in the morning room with the composed readiness of someone who has rehearsed this conversation many times and is now discovering that the rehearsed version and the actual version share their subject matter, but nothing else. He was 50. And the 11 years since his departure from Gerald Renwick's chambers had marked him not with bitterness, which would have been understandable and legible, but with a quality of compressed endurance, the look of someone who had taken a very difficult thing and built their life around it rather than from it. His practice in Leamington Spa was, Poirot had established through a morning telephone call to his London contacts, respectable and modest, and not what it would have been had his career continued on its earlier trajectory. "You came on Tuesday," Poirot said. "Mr. Renwick sent for you." "He wrote to me in September," Ashe said. "He said he was coming home from Switzerland and that there were things he needed to address. He said he required my presence for certain of those things. He said..." He paused. "He said he owed me an explanation and that he intended to provide one and that the explanation would require my participation in what came next. And you came. I came because Gerald Renwick was the most rigidly honest man I had known for the first 20 years of my professional life. And the letter he sent me was the first communication I had received from him in 11 years. And the fact that he had written it at all meant that whatever it cost him, And it cost him something. I could hear it in the way the letter was written. He had decided it was necessary. He looked at his hands.
At a man like that, writing a letter like that, you go. Tell me about the document, Poirot said. Ash looked at him steadily. How much do you know? I know that in March 1925, a man named Thomas Ede was convicted of the murder of a man named Frederick Dowell in Warwick. I know that the conviction rested substantially on a witness statement that had passed through Gerald Renwick's chambers, which were at that time engaged in private practice before his appointment to the bench. I know that Thomas Ede served 9 years of a life sentence, was released in 1934, and died in 1935. Poirot paused. I know that the witness statement was altered. I do not yet know with absolute certainty by whom. I am forming a clear view, but I prefer certainty to a clear view. You can provide the certainty. Ash was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Philip altered it. The morning room received this without comment. The kitchen garden continued its still brown October patience outside the window. He was a clerk in the chambers at the time, Ash said. 19 years old, recently come in. Intelligent, very intelligent even then. Gerald had a great deal of confidence in him, which was perhaps more confidence than was appropriate given his age and the specific situation. He paused. The case against Ede, the original witness statement, implicated a man named Hargreaves, not in the murder itself, but in the circumstances that had preceded it, the business dealings, the nature of the relationship between Hargreaves and Dowell. Hargreaves was a client of the chambers, a significant one.
The kind of client whose continued business was material. Philip altered the statement to remove the references to Hargreaves. Philip altered 3 passages. The alterations were skillful. He had a good hand, which was part of why Gerald had trusted him with documents. The altered version implicated Ede more directly and Hargreaves not at all. He stopped. Gerald found out 2 weeks after the conviction. By then, Ede was sentenced. Hargreaves was... Gerald confronted him privately. Hargreaves denied any involvement in the alteration and threatened, if Gerald pursued the matter, to implicate Gerald himself, to suggest that the alteration had been made with Gerald's knowledge and at his direction. Gerald was newly appointed to the bar. His career, his reputation, everything. He made a choice, Poirot said.
He made the choice that a man makes when he believes his own continued integrity in all future cases is worth the injustice of one present one. Ash's voice was very even. I believe he told himself that Thomas Ede, while innocent of the specific act, was not an entirely blameless character, and that this made the balance somewhat less terrible than it was. He paused. He dismissed me because I had found out. I had noticed the alterations, which were visible to anyone who knew Philip's hand and looked closely at the document. Gerald could not keep me and risk my speaking. He gave me a reference that was excellent in every respect except the ones that mattered for advancement, and I went to Leamington and built what I could. And Hargreaves died in 1931.
At which point, Gerald had lost the immediate threat that had originally silenced him. But 11 years is a long time. And the habit of silence, once established, is substantial. He looked at the window. Switzerland seems to have broken the habit. Switzerland and a sick heart and a man's honest reckoning with what he will be remembered for, Poirot said. He came home to finish a letter to the Lord Chief Justice. 3/4 of it was written in the locked drawer of his study. He had only the final paragraph remaining. He paused. He did not live to write it. Philip knew about the letter. Ash looked at him. How? Because the letter refers to documents that Philip recognized. Gerald showed him, not the letter itself, I think, but the evidence, the papers he had reviewed in Switzerland.
He gave Philip the opportunity to speak first, or to participate in the correction, or simply to know that the correction was coming. This was, I believe, Gerald's version of mercy. Philip experienced it differently. He experienced it as a death sentence, Ash said quietly. His career, his marriage, his position in this town, everything he had built on the assumption that the original wrong would remain buried. If Gerald spoke,
Philip would be exposed not only as the man who had altered the document, but as the man who had, in effect, let an innocent man spend 9 years in prison. He looked at the morning room carpet. Did Gerald understand what he was doing to his son? Gerald understood, I believe, that he had failed in his duty to Thomas Eade 11 years ago, and that this failure had continued to accumulate interest in the former Philip's continued immunity and Thomas Eade's ruined and shortened life, and that the moment for correction had arrived regardless of its cost to the people around him. Poirot paused. He was a judge. He believed in the law's requirement that the truth be heard. The difficulty was that the truth he intended to speak had been purchased, at least in part, by his own silence, and the purchase price would now be paid by his son. Ash looked at him with the expression of a man seeing a situation he has lived inside for 11 years suddenly from the outside and finding the view both clarifying and deeply, permanently sad. "What happens now?" he said. "Now," Poirot said, "I speak with Philip Renwick." He thanked Ash and went to find the elder son of Avonmere House, who was waiting with the specific quality of someone who has been waiting for a very long time in the study where his father had died. Philip Renwick was standing at the study window when Poirot entered, standing and looking out at the garden in the posture of a man who has chosen a view of the outside because the inside of the room is too present and too specific in its associations. The study had been returned by Inspector Barker's men to its approximate normal state. The writing paper removed to evidence, the decanter and glass removed, the pen removed. What remained was the desk and the chair and the bookshelves and the quiet authority of a room that had been a judge's working space for 30 years.
And Philip Renwick standing at its window with his back to all of this, with the deliberate quality of a man who cannot look at the room he is in. He turned when Poirot entered and presented his face with the conscious composure that had been present in the drawing room, more controlled now, the way things become more controlled when they have been worked on for several hours. He was 38, and he looked this morning considerably older. "I have spoken with Mrs. Potts," Poirot said, sitting in the chair across from the desk. "And with Mr. Ash." Philip sat down. He sat the way a structure sits down when the load-bearing calculation has been revised. Not collapsed, but altered. The engineering now visible in a way it had not been before. "Then you know," he said. "I know a great deal," Poirot said. "What I wish to know from you is what I cannot know from them. Because the things only you know are the things that will complete the picture, and the picture will be completed regardless. The question is only whether it is completed by you or assembled, more slowly and more painfully, from everything around you." Philip looked at the desk. He looked at it for a long time with the expression of a man conducting a final, comprehensive inventory of everything that has brought him to this specific chair at this specific desk on this specific Friday morning. "I was 19, he said. "That is not an excuse. I know it is not an excuse, but it is the context, the beginning of the context." He paused. "Hargreaves was a significant client. My father had said so explicitly, not as a direction to me, but as a statement of fact in a conversation about the case."
I understood what it meant. I was 19 and I had been in the chambers for 6 months, and I understood very clearly what the continued engagement of a significant client meant for the chambers and for my own position in it. And the document passed through your hands. It was routine, the fair copying of a witness statement before it went to the prosecution, a job for a clerk. I read the original and I understood in reading it what it would do to Hargreaves. He stopped. "I want to be honest with you. I want to say that I acted out of some misguided sense of institutional loyalty, or that I was manipulated, or that I was too young to understand the full weight of what I was doing." He looked at Poirot. "None of that is entirely true. I altered the document because I calculated that it served my position to do so."
"And the 19-year-old who made that calculation knew that what he was doing was wrong and did it anyway,"
He simply weighed the immediate consequences against the abstract ones and chose incorrectly. And Ede? Philip was quiet for a moment. I told myself Ede was not. I told myself various things about Thomas Ede that made it possible to continue living with what I had done. That he was not a good man. That the jury might have convicted him anyway. That the specific piece of evidence I had altered was not the only evidence against him. He stopped. I have stopped telling myself those things since my father came home from Switzerland. There was something in his face, the first evening he was back, that made it impossible to continue telling them. He showed you the evidence he had found on his second day home. He brought me into this room and showed me the papers. He said he had known for years that the alteration had been made and that he had made a choice he could not, in the time remaining to him, continue to justify. He said he intended to write to the Lord Chief Justice and that he was telling me because he thought I should know before he acted and because he thought there was a possibility, a small one, he acknowledged, that I might choose to act first. He looked at the desk. He was giving me the opportunity to go to the authorities myself, to make the confession voluntary rather than compelled. And you did not take it. I considered it for 3 days. I sat with it for 3 days, and I looked at my wife, and I looked at this town, and I looked at 20 years of a career, and I could not. He stopped. I am not a man who faces this kind of accounting with any grace. I know that now. I thought I was. I had told myself for 11 years that I was, in all other respects, a man of integrity, that the one wrong was contained, separated, not representative of who I really was. He paused. My father's return demonstrated that the one wrong is not contained. It never was. The poison, Poirot said, through a client, a pharmaceutical supplier, a legitimate one, but one whose inventory, if one knew what to ask for and how to ask, included compounds not generally available. I had accessed his accounts a year ago for an estate matter. I knew the name of a specific compound. It was not difficult, which is the most terrible thing about it. It was simply not difficult. The decanter. Thursday afternoon. I went to the study while my father was resting. I added the compound to the decanter. Not to his glass. I need you to know this, though I recognize it makes very little practical difference. I did not add it specifically to his glass. I told myself that if someone else happened to drink from the decanter first. He stopped. I told myself a number of things that evening, Monsieur Poirot. I have spent the night identifying how many of them were lies. You went to the study corridor at 8:50, Poirot said. Mrs. Potts heard your voice. I don't know what I went to do, to check, to speak to him, He stopped. I heard him in the study moving, still alive, and I thought about going in, and I stood in the corridor, and I could not make myself go in. And I said something, I don't remember what, something that was addressed to the door rather than to him. And then I heard him pour the brandy. He looked at his hands. And I came away. Poirot looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, with the careful honesty he brought to such moments, Mr. Renwick, there is a letter in the locked drawer of that desk. Your father wrote 3/4 of it in Switzerland and the remainder in these last 2 weeks. It is addressed to the Lord Chief Justice and it contains everything, the altered document, the evidence of who altered it, the full account of what occurred in 1925 and why, and your father's own account of his failure to correct it earlier. He paused. The letter is complete. It needs only a final paragraph, which your father did not live to write. But the substance is there. The evidence is there. The police and the Lord Chief Justice will have access to it. Philip looked at the desk with the expression of a man reading a text that has already been written and finding in it the precise and complete accounting of himself. Thomas Ede, Poirot said quietly. He served 9 years. He was released in 34 and died in 35. He was 51 years old. He left no family. His wife had died while he was incarcerated. The wrong done to him cannot be corrected. His conviction can be reviewed posthumously. His name can be cleared. That is what remains possible. It is not sufficient. It is what is available. Philip said nothing. There was nothing to say. "Inspector Barker is in the hall," Poirot said. "I believe you know what comes next." "Yes," Philip said. "I have known what comes next since my father walked through the front door 2 weeks ago." The afternoon that followed Philip Renwick's interview was the afternoon of the secondary conversations, the ones that were not the center of the case but were its texture, the human material that surrounded the hard facts of crime and motive and method and gave them their full weight and complexity. Poirot conducted them with the attention he brought to all conversations that were not the central one, which was the same quality of attention he brought to the central ones, because in his experience, the peripheral and the central had a way of exchanging positions depending on the angle from which they were viewed. Dr. Owen Marsh received him in the sitting room, where he had been waiting with the composure of a man who has decided that composure is appropriate and has applied it systematically. He was 55, and his 20 years as the Renwick family physician had given him the specific quality of someone who has been a witness to a family's intimate life across 2 decades and has learned to hold this intimacy with the care that professional responsibility requires and the weight that genuine human involvement produces. "The medical report from Switzerland," Poirot said. "The one you altered at Gerald's specific request." Marsh looked at him without flinching, which was itself a form of prepared honesty. "He asked me to alter the severity rating," he said. "His heart condition, it was serious, genuinely. But the specific prognosis he asked me to record was more urgent than the clinical picture fully supported. He wanted it to appear on paper that his return from Switzerland was medically compelled rather than chosen. So that the people here would not see it as a decision," Poirot said. "So that it would not look like a man returning to complete unfinished business, but like a sick man coming home. He thought it would give him more time. That if his return appeared involuntary, medical necessity rather than deliberate choice, the people with reasons to be alarmed would have less immediate cause for alarm and he would be able to make his preparations without triggering a response." Marsh paused. He was wrong about this, as it turned out, but the intention was, he was trying to manage the situation to the best possible outcome. He was trying to give everyone, including Philip, the opportunity to do the right thing without catastrophe. "What did you know about the underlying matter?" Poirot asked. "Less than I might have. Gerald told me in Switzerland, told me there were things from the past that he needed to correct, and that he needed to do it carefully. He did not tell me the specifics. I think he was protecting me from the knowledge that would have obligated me to act before he was ready." Marsh looked at the window. "He was a man of considerable consideration for other people, Monsieur Poirot, when it came to the mechanics of difficult situations. His failure was not the failure of consideration. It was the failure of a man who had been considering for too long. You had no knowledge of the nature of what Philip had done." "None. If I had—" He stopped. "I would like to say that I would have acted differently. I believe I would have. But I have spent 30 years in medicine learning that the things I would like to say about my hypothetical behavior are not always reliable guides to the behavior I would actually produce." Poirot found this response among the most honest he had received in the course of the morning, and he said so, which appeared to both surprise and steady the doctor. The conversation with Nora Renwick was conducted in the small morning room at Nora's request. She had asked, with the direct intelligence that Poirot had noticed from the beginning, whether she might speak with him privately rather than with her husband present, and he had agreed without asking her to explain the request, because the request was itself the explanation. She sat across from him with the watchful composure of a woman who has been intelligent about her marriage for 8 years and who has arrived in the last 2 weeks at a point where intelligence is no longer sufficient. "The letters from the attic," Poirot said. 3 weeks ago," she said. "I was looking for a specific document, something Philip needed from the old estate papers. I found in the same box a bundle of letters addressed to Gerald from a woman named Margaret Hartwell. They dated from 1915 to 1920. She paused. "I read enough to understand their nature. I did not read more than I needed to understand." "You told no one?" I told no one because I have spent 8 years in this family, understanding that the things which are not said are sometimes the things that hold the structure together, and that the timing of saying them matters as much as the saying." She looked at the morning room carpet. "I also told no one because my husband was, in those 3 weeks, very clearly under a considerable private strain, and I was afraid of what adding to it would produce." She paused. "I was right to be afraid. I was wrong in what I was afraid of." "You were watching him," Poirot said. "You knew something was very wrong. I knew my husband. I have known my husband for 12 years. The person who has been living in our house for the past 2 weeks has been my husband performing my husband, and the performance, while excellent, is not the same thing." She looked at Poirot with the direct, undeceived intelligence of a woman who loves someone she has just seen clearly. "He altered the document, didn't he?" "The one Gerald had found." "Yes." She was quiet. The morning room held this information with the same patience it had held everything else. "He has confessed," Poirot said. "He is with Inspector Barker now." She received this with the stillness of a woman who was prepared for it. Not prepared in the sense of being ready. No one is ready for this, but prepared in the sense of having known, in some level beneath the level of explicit thought, that this was where the road led, and having spent 2 weeks in the anticipation of an arrival that had just occurred. "The letters," Poirot said. "What will you do with them?" She looked at him. "What would you do?" "I would," Poirot said carefully, "recognize that they belong to a version of Gerald Renwick that existed before any of this, and that Mrs. Renwick is the person best placed to make decisions about what belongs to her household, and that the letters are part of her household." He paused. "What they tell her about her husband is something she must weigh against what she already knows. The weighing is hers." She nodded. She stood. At the door she said, "He came home to do right, in the end." "Yes," Poirot said, "in the end. He found Clara Renwick last, in the garden, because Clara had gone to the garden at some point in the afternoon, and the garden seemed to suit the conversation they needed to have, or rather, the very short conversation, because what Clara needed was not a long exchange of information, but the specific and simple release of one thing." "The handkerchief," Poirot said, standing beside her in the autumn garden. "I went in at 8:40, she said. To return a book I'd borrowed from his shelves. He wasn't there, he'd stepped out, I thought. I left the book on the desk, and my handkerchief fell from my pocket when I set the book down, and I didn't notice it." She looked at him. That is all, Poirot confirmed. The relief on her face was the expression of someone who has spent 3 days in the shadow of a fear and has just stepped out of it into the uncomplicated light of a simple truth. It was, Poirot thought, one of the finest and most complete expressions of relief he had seen in 30 years of encountering people on the far side of things they had been afraid of. "You saw nothing," he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was there for 30 seconds. "Then you have nothing to carry," he said. "That is a considerable gift, in the circumstances." She looked at the October garden with an expression that was still processing the dimensions of that gift. A disoriented feeling of someone whose body has readjusted to a lighter load and does not yet know what to do with the change. Poirot stood before the fireplace and addressed them in the manner he had described to himself since the previous evening, as completing an interrupted sentence on behalf of someone who could no longer complete it himself. He said, "Mr. Gerald Renwick returned from Switzerland with a purpose. He had spent 6 months in the company of his own conscience, which is a very particular kind of company. It makes few concessions and keeps its own hours. And he had arrived at a conclusion that he had been, if I understand his character correctly, approaching for some time, but had required the specific clarifications of illness and distance to reach. The conclusion was this: that a wrong he had permitted 11 years ago was still being paid for by a man who was now dead, and that his own continued silence made him a continuing participant in that payment. He described the events of 1925 with the precision and the care they required. The document, the alteration, Thomas Eade, The 9 years of imprisonment, the years of broken life that followed release, the death in 1935. He described Gerald's discovery in Switzerland and his return, and the letter in the locked drawer, 3/4 complete, addressed to the Lord Chief Justice. He gave his son the opportunity to speak first, Poirot said. This was his version of mercy, and it was also, I think, his version of hope. He hoped that Philip, given the opportunity, would find the courage that he himself had found only very late. Philip did not find it. The consequences of what he had done were too present, too immediately catastrophic, and the decision he made was the decision of a man who has been maintaining a specific structure for 11 years and cannot imagine surviving its collapse. He did not dramatize what Philip had done. He described it precisely, which was its own form of weight. The compound in the decanter, the voice in the corridor at 8:50, the sound of the brandy being poured, the 9 words on the paper that were not, as they had first appeared, a fragment of a confession, but the beginning of a formal letter to the highest judicial authority in England, and a letter that was now complete in every respect except its final paragraph. The final paragraph, Poirot said, will be provided by the Lord Chief Justice's office working from the evidence assembled by this inquiry. Gerald Renwick will be heard as he intended to be heard, though the hearing has taken a different form than he planned. He looked around the room. He deserves to be heard. The wrong done to Thomas Ede was first Philip's and then Gerald's, and the correction of it is first Gerald's and then the law's. The law will conduct its processes. I will say only this, that a man who returns from 6 months in Switzerland with a bad heart and a clear conscience to do the right thing, and who is killed before the right thing is completed, has not failed. He has been failed. And the difference between those two things is precisely the difference that matters. Mrs. Dorothea Renwick was looking at the fire when he said this, and she did not look up, but her expression changed with the quality of someone receiving a thing they needed. After the formal business was done, and Barker conducted it with the thoroughness and dignity the occasion required, which Poirot acknowledged with the respect he had for policemen who understood that thoroughness and dignity were not in competition. The household dispersed in its various directions, and Poirot sat for a while in the drawing room alone, which was an unusual thing for him to do after the conclusion of an inquiry, but which felt, on this particular October afternoon in this particular room, appropriate. He thought about 9 words on a sheet of paper. He thought about the sentence that had not been finished and the sentence that now would be. He thought about Thomas Ede, who had no one in this room to grieve him but whose name would now be cleared, and about what that clearing was worth to a man who was past receiving it, and about whether worth and value were the same thing when measured across the distance between the living and the dead. He thought they were not the same thing. He thought the clearing had value regardless of the receipt. He thought Gerald Renwick, somewhere in the accounting of things, would find this conclusion satisfactory. Outside the drawing room windows, the October afternoon continued its unhurried decline. The elms were losing their leaves steadily and without drama, which was the right way to lose them. Tanja Poirot walked back to Elm Row on the Saturday morning through a Wychford-on-Avon that was conducting its weekly market with the complete indifference to the previous 48 hours that market towns reserve for their own continuation. The stalls were set up in the square. The baker's boy was cycling along the high street with his morning deliveries. The solicitor's brass plate caught the October sun and returned it with the faithful precision of something whose job is to reflect rather than to originate. The elms along the road were losing their leaves in the steady, unhurried way that Poirot had observed on his arrival a week ago, and now observed again from the other side of a considerable amount of intervening experience. The leaves fell individually, each one making its own brief descent, and the road below them was accumulating a thin, bright layer of yellow that the morning's thin wind was gently redistributing without urgency or plan. Dr. Sheppard was at his breakfast when Poirot arrived, and he had the manner of a man who had been kept informed. Country doctors are always kept informed. It is one of the structural features of their position. and was managing a complicated set of feelings about the situation with the help of toast and strong tea. He poured a second cup without asking and looked at Poirot with the direct, unceremonious regard of an old friendship. "Philip Renwick," he said. "Philip Renwick," Poirot confirmed, sitting down and accepting the tisane that Sheppard's housekeeper had produced with the silent efficiency that had made her, in Poirot's estimation,
as one of the finest housekeepers of his acquaintance. "I've known that family for 20 years, Sheppard said. "Yes." "Philip, I would not have said, I would not, 20 years ago, or 10 or 5, have identified Philip Renwick as a man capable of this." "No," Poirot said. "The capacity for this kind of act is not usually visible in advance. It reveals itself only when the specific circumstances that make it necessary arrive. Most people never encounter those circumstances. Philip Renwick encountered them twice, once at 19 and once at 38, and made the same calculation on both occasions." He paused. "The second time, with considerably more experience and considerably more knowledge of what the calculation cost, which makes it harder to account for and easier to understand simultaneously." Sheppard looked at his toast.
Gerald was a man who made one serious error and spent 30 years becoming the kind of man who could no longer live with it, Poirot said. "This is not a simple process, and it is not, in the end, a failure. It is the specific kind of human moral development that takes too long and costs too much and is genuine." He looked at the morning through Sheppard's sitting room window. He came home to speak the truth. He was killed before he could finish the first sentence. The sentence will be finished by other means, which is the best that can be done. "And Hilda Potts," Sheppard said. He had known her, of course. 20 years of the Renwick family's health meant 20 years of occasional encounters with their housekeeper. "Mrs. Potts carried what she heard for a night and a morning," Poirot said.
"She carried it with the specific loyalty of someone who has been part of a household long enough that the household's people are her people, and who was therefore asked, by what she knew, to choose between two different kinds of loyalty. She chose correctly. She chose slowly, and she suffered for the slowness, but she chose correctly." He paused. "I told her she was not responsible for what was done with what she did not say. I believe this to be true. What was done before she had the opportunity to determine whether to speak. Her speaking or not speaking in those hours would not have changed the outcome for Gerald. It changes only what comes next, and what comes next is the inquiry and the letter and Thomas Eade's name." Sheppard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thomas Eade."
I looked him up this morning. I have contacts at the Warwick Prison Service from an old case. He had no family by the time he was released. Lived in Coventry for 8 months in a boarding house. Died of pneumonia in January 1935. "Yes," Poirot said. "He died 11 years after the wrong was done to him and had 9 of those 11 years removed from him by imprisonment. The posthumous review of his conviction will produce a legal document and perhaps a brief notice in the regional papers and the satisfaction of the official record being corrected." He paused. "It will not return to him what was taken. Nothing can. What it can do is ensure that his name in the permanent record of the law is correct, that the adjudication against him is marked as the error it was, that the document that was altered to produce his conviction is recognized as the alteration it was." He looked at his tisane. "This is not enough. It is what is available. I have learned to distinguish carefully between those two assessments because confusing them produces either false satisfaction or false despair, and neither serves." Sheppard looked at him with the specific regard of an old friend who is seeing the other person with the full clarity of long acquaintance. "Was it a difficult one?" he said. Poirot considered. He gave the question the consideration it deserved, which was genuine and took a moment. "They are all difficult," he said. "The mechanics, the poison, the corridor, the decanter. These are not difficult. I have encountered more technically complex crimes and considerably more subtle methods." "The difficulty of this one is different," he paused. "The difficulty is that the person who died was, in the end, trying to do something good. He was doing it late. and the lateness had costs, and the manner of his attempting it had flaws, he did not see or did not wish to see that giving Philip the opportunity to speak first was also giving Philip the opportunity to act first. But the direction of his intention in the final accounting was correct. He looked at the October street through Sheppard's window, the elms, the leaves, the morning's ordinary business proceeding with its ordinary patience. Cases in which the victim was attempting something good are the most difficult, he said, because the question that follows the solution is not merely who and how, but what now? What becomes of the thing they were attempting? Whether it continues and in whose hands, and whether the hands are adequate to it. He paused. In this case, I believe they are. The letter is in the possession of the Lord Chief Justice's office. Leonard Ashe has offered to provide the final paragraph, which is a thing he is entirely qualified to do and which he will do correctly. Mrs. Dorothea Renwick will manage what remains of the household with the capability she has always brought to it, which is considerable. And Thomas Ede, who deserves to have his name in this account, who deserves to be more than a name in this account, but whose life I know only in outline, will be, at the conclusion of the review, correctly recorded. He drank his tisane. Sheppard drank his tea. Outside, a leaf fell from the nearest elm in the slow, determined way of October leaves that have made their decision and are proceeding with it. Gerald Renwick spoke 9 words, Poirot said, before he was silenced. Those 9 words, the truth about the night of March the, were the beginning of a sentence that had been waiting 11 years to be spoken. The sentence is now complete. It is not the completion he planned, or the completion he deserved, or the completion that Thomas Ede deserved. It is the completion that remains possible. He set down his cup. Poirot has finished many sentences for people who could no longer finish them themselves. This is the nature of his work. But this particular sentence, this one he will remember. Sheppard said nothing, because nothing was required. Outside, Wychford-on-Avon conducted its Saturday morning. The bells of the church marked the hour. The market square completed its business. The elms along the road continued their patient, steady, unhurried work of letting go. And on Elm Row, in a solicitor's sitting room, 2 old friends sat in the October morning and were quiet together, which is the specific and valuable thing that old friendships make available, and which no other arrangement of human relations can provide in quite the same way. Finn,